Welcome back to the channel, where today we will be looking at all the AFC teams and how their free agency went. We're going to go into the classroom and hand out these grades. Now, this took a little longer to come out than I was hoping. Partly was I had the video fully filmed, basically completely edited, and then one of these teams decided to make a teeny tiny trade that I felt was worthy of going back, cutting out that part, and refilming that part. But we'll get there in a little bit. So, let's get into it. Let's see how your team did. Let's see if you guys have a better chance or worse chance at getting to the Super Bowl. And please, if you like the video, follow, smash the like button, subscribe. Next week I'm going to come out with a couple of draft videos, and I'll give you my unimportant opinions on which prospects I like. But let's get into it. And the first team that we'll talk about will be the Ravens. Now, before actually looking into the Ravens offseason, I was thinking B+ or an A, just because of the way everyone was talking about it. But honestly, I don't love how the Ravens free agency has gone. We'll start with the good. They re-signed Matabuke, which was very important. And then, of course, the big news was the upgrade at running back with Henry. Now, is Henry what he used to be? No. But he's still great, and I think he'll fit that offense very well. Specifically, I think their red zone offense will be amazing. But speaking of the offense, the Ravens' offensive line got gutted this offseason. They traded Morgan Moses, who started 14 games. They lost in free agency both John Simpson, who started 17, and Kevin Zeitler, who started 15 and made the Pro Bowl. So they literally lost over half of their offensive line. They also lost starting safety Geno Smith and starting linebacker and Pro Bowler Patrick Queen, two starters on the defense. Now, those losses would have been a little harsher if they already didn't have one of the best safeties and best inside linebackers in the league. So that helps, but those losses will still hurt that defense. With all that said, the Ravens are still one of the best teams in the league. They're extremely well ran. They'll find the good replacements, whether it's in the draft or they might already be on their roster. They're just not starting yet. But you can't deny the fact they lost a ton of talent this offseason. I don't doubt they'll still be one of the best three teams in the AFC. At worst case, they'll be like maybe the top 5, but they'll still be a playoff team. But that's not what we're grading today. We're grading the free agency. And to be honest, I give the Ravens a C+ in that department because it did not go very well. So let's see how Cleveland did this year. It was a pretty quiet offseason for the Browns, so far at least, but that doesn't necessarily mean bad. They started by trading for Jerry Jeudy for a 5th and 6th round pick, which originally I really liked, as that's pretty low return for a former 1st round pick who, while he hasn't panned to become who he's supposed to be, he's still shown flashes of promise. And for a wide receiver 2, I don't know, I think you could do a lot worse. But they gave him an extension almost immediately, which I think made 0 sense. It still might end up being a good contract, as it's not crazy expensive. So if he can show you why he was a 1st round pick, the contract's fine and the grade goes up. But I don't think he's proven himself enough to get that kind of guaranteed money. So on the defensive side, they lost 2 linebackers, and I'm going to botch this name, but Stone Takatia and Anthony Walker. But they picked up Jordan Hicks, and they also re-signed Zadarius Smith, who was very important for that offense. So I think they'll still stay elite on that side of the ball. I probably would have given the Browns a B+, but I really didn't like that extension. So I dropped them down a little bit to a B-, but I still think they are a great team overall. They just need Deshaun Watson to kind of be Deshaun Watson. So on to the Bengals, and they really focused on shoring up their defense, which was a major key move for them. They ended up plucking Geno Stone from the Ravens and brought back former Bengal Von Bell. So they improved the secondary. They signed Rankings. So all 3 of these moves will for sure help and tighten up that defense and added some overall depth to the team. They then signed offensive lineman Trent Brown, and while he does seem to have some rough moments here or there, overall, he seems like a good lineman, and we know the Bengals just kind of need that help. The biggest headline news they had was getting rid of Joe Mixon and bringing in Zach Moss. While Mixon, is historically better, of course, I think you can make an argument Zach Moss is a little more versatile, a little more athletic nowadays, and he's been more efficient the past few years. So I think at worst, the Bengals actually made a lateral move. If anything, they might have even gotten better at the running back position nowadays, but Zach Moss comes cheaper. So even if they just made a lateral move, Zach Moss is cheaper. Smart move. Now, the Bengals' final grade will depend on what happens with T. Higgins. Higgins requested a trade because they won't give him the contract extension he wants. He's franchise tagged currently. So depending on what kind of return they get for him, or if he just doesn't get traded and he plays, or if he sits out, their grade could fluctuate. I kind of give them a range between a B- and a B+. I don't think their trade could be so bad where they get lower than a B-. I also don't think they'll get such a good return in where they get higher than a B+. So I put them in that B- to B+ range. And to finish up the AFC North, we're going to go with my personal favorite team, the Steelers. Now, I'm sure some of you might think I'm being a homer, but I really think the Steelers had one of the best free agencies. But we'll start with the big news. That was bringing in Russell Wilson and Justin Fields for very little. While neither are guaranteed to play good, let's be honest, the Steelers got to 10 wins with a quarterback combo of Kenny Pickett and Mason Rudolph. So getting those two guys is a win for sure. And combined, they're like less than $5 million for this year. Then they were able to bring in Patrick Queen, which is a very big deal because if you pay attention to the Steelers at all, the inside linebacker position has been a massive problem ever since Ryan Shazier's injury. So they were able to get not only a huge upgrade at inside linebacker, but they were also able to take him away from the Ravens. They then traded for Dante Jackson, sending out Deontay Jackson, which I already talked about in my last video going over the NFC. Jackson hasn't been great, but let's be honest, it's hard to be great in Carolina the past few years. So we'll see how that pans out, but he is uber athletic, and Deontay Johnson, I think he just kind of needed a change of scenery. And while this might seem unimportant, the Steelers also had a huge upgrade at punter. Last year they had one of the worst punters in the league, now they bring in one of the best. And trust me, from someone who's watched a lot of games with one of the worst offenses in the league, having a punter that can put the other team back is a very big deal. So I give the Steelers an A-. They still need to add another receiver, at least one. And they need to get a center and buff up the offensive tackle position and the corners. But I think the Steelers, for a 10-win team, got drastically better. On to my least favorite division when it comes to how they did in free agency, the AFC West. But we'll start with a team that has done pretty well the past few years, the Chiefs. And the rich keep getting richer. They pretty much did what they needed to do right away, and that was re-signing Chris Jones. Their defense is just massively different with him on and off the field. They also re-signed linebacker Tranquil, another big deal. They let Willie Gay Jr. walk, who I mentioned in my last video, who I probably like a little too much, but I think they'll be okay without him. And the last part of their defense is they finally ended up trading Snead. Their trade return wasn't that good, so, I maybe knock him a little bit for that, but I don't really think the market was there because of how much money he wanted. When you're trading a player who demands a contract extension, a big one, and you got to give up picks, most teams don't really want to invest in that. Then they went ahead and added Hollywood Brown on a very, very friendly deal. As weird as it sounds, just how they are historically, or the past few years, the Chiefs' passing offense was one of their biggest struggles last year. And that was because of the lack of weapons. Well, Hollywood helps for sure. While he hasn't been great since his rookie year, you could tell that there's a lot of talent there. And I just think he really needs to be paired with an elite QB, and Mahomes is the definition of that. I would probably give the Chiefs an A-. Maybe you could bump them down to a B+ because of their lack of return for Snead. But again, I just don't really think there was another option there. He obviously wanted out due to the contract disagrees. So I'd give the Chiefs an A-, and they're still Super Bowl favorites. Then the Raiders. Where they started was adding defensive lineman Wilkins, who all of a sudden creates one of the best pass rushing duos in the league. So that was a great pickup. And they will also re-sign center Andre James as well. So they're definitely focusing on the trenches. Now their QB position is pretty rough. They still have O'Connell, and they brought in Gardner Minshew, who played well last season, but I don't really think anyone sees him as a long-term, multiple playoff performer. And they don't really look like they're in a position to draft one of the top 4 QBs. They could trade up to get one, but it looks tough. They also lost Josh Jacobs, but I don't think that's not a big deal with the current state of the team. They don't really need to invest in a running back. The offseason was pretty boring. They've had some good moves, but they also lacking the upside at like positions like quarterback and receiver besides Adams. So they're kind of in one of those weird spots where they're not really choosing a direction. But I give the Raiders a B. Pretty plain offseason. Now we get to my 2 least favorite off seasons in the whole league, probably. Maybe along with the Saints. And we'll start with the one of the two, the Chargers. Let's go over who they lost. Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Gerald Everett, and Austin Eckler. They currently have no legit weapons on their roster. They were able to restructure Mack and Bosa, so they keep that pass rush going. But they also had to release Eric Kendricks and lost Kenneth Murray. I understand the Chargers were in an extremely tough position with the cap space, but I don't like the direction they went to fix it. They decided to try to keep more of the defense, was a smart play, but their defense wasn't good last year anyways. And if anything, now it'll be worse. So not only do you have a bad defense still, but you also have a significantly worse offense as well. The only offensive players they brought in to replace those guys were 2 tight ends, Will Disley and Hayden Hurst, and running back Gus Edwards. But none of those are game changers. It's almost guaranteed they'll draft one of these receivers in the draft, but they desperately have to have him succeed basically right away if they want to be any competitive this year. I give the Chargers the only F of free agency this year. But if you're a Broncos fan, don't think yours was much better. They started the offseason with the biggest news of releasing Russell Wilson, but they still have to pay a large amount for him. They also released Pro Bowler Justin Simmons, traded Jerry Jeudy for extremely little, lost center Cushenberry, and linebacker Joel. The Broncos basically cleared house and hit that reset button, which I actually think was the right move. But where they lost points was they basically got nothing in return. Now, I understand the NFL is very different from the NBA when it comes to trades. You can't just trade any player who's still good for assets. You know, NFL teams don't trade picks as often. But it would have just been nice to see them get a little bit in return for those guys leaving. You know, maybe some extra late round picks for players like Justin Simmons. You know, I don't really see the point of keeping someone like Javonte Williams around. So I think there was a better route to take. So I give the Broncos a D+, but I do agree that it's time to let the rebuild begin. Speaking of cap hell, here we are in the AFC East and the Bills. The Bills also had to make some significantly tough roster decisions as they lost Poyer, Leonard Floyd, Sierra Neal, Cam Lewis, all pretty relevant players to their team. They were able to re-sign Dawkins and Edwards to maintain that offensive line. They let Gabe Davis leave, which I think is okay. They brought in Curtis Samuel. I would say Samuel was a worse receiver, but he's probably more versatile, and I think the Bills' offense could get a little creative with him. And then they re-signed Epson on a friendly deal. I give the Bills a B-. With the cap limitations, they probably did just as good of a job as they could have done, but they're still going to need to fill some pretty big holes with some rookies and some cheap contracts. Moving on down to Miami, the Dolphins stocked up. They added Poyer, which taking him from the Bills makes it even sweeter for them. Linebackers Walker and Brooks, added Kendall Fuller, edge rusher Shaq Barrett, and center Aaron Brewer. So they really stacked up on positions all over the field. They did lose a couple important pieces though, with Wilkins, who I mentioned earlier, or hurt that pass rush. Linebacker Jerome Baker was very reliable, and linebacker Van Ginkel. But overall, I liked what they did. I'm not going to say I loved it just because I'm not sure how many massive impact players they got, but they definitely got better. I'll give Finns a B+. Then going all the way up north to everyone's favorite former dynasty, the Patriots. Most of the Pats' free agency was spent just re-signing their own players, which is not a bad thing. They brought back Duggar and Onwenu, Bourne, Hunter Henry, Uch, Ellis, and Wheatley Jr., all pretty important guys. The biggest thing is they were able to keep a lot of good players without crushing their payroll for the next year. And I think if they draft well and are aggressive next year to build around whatever QB they take this year, assuming they're smart enough to take one this year, they can actually be pretty dangerous again pretty fast. So keeping this one nice and short and sweet, I think the Patriots are going to be. Then to wrap up this division, all the way up in New York, the Jets really solidified their offensive line with trading for Morgan Moses, signing John Simpson and Tyron Smith. This gives them a lot more flexibility for their first round pick. They could go wide receiver, defense, they could go tight end, they could even go tackle still, just to have a future guy to replace one of these older veterans. They also brought in Mike Williams, who can be a really good wide receiver 2, or depending how they draft again, an excellent wide receiver 3. And then they took a flyer on a former high draft pick Kinlaw to boost that defense. The only significant loss is losing pass rusher Huff. He was very good, but the Jets get an A this year, and if Rodgers can be healthy, I think they could be very legit. So to wrap up the video, we'll cover the AFC South, and we'll start with the Jaguars. They had a pretty interesting offseason as they lost a lot, but gained a lot too. So they brought in Gabe Davis, who I'm not a massive fan of, but you could be worse. But they lost Calvin Ridley. So they downgraded, but Ridley signed a massive contract. So I think letting him walk was the right decision for sure. They added center Mitch Morse. They added the defensive lineman Eric Armstead. They re-signed lineman Cleveland. They franchise tagged Josh Allen. So they definitely improved their offensive line and defensive linemen. They're really focusing on the trenches. They did lose Darius Williams, corner, so that'll hurt, but I give the Jaguars a B+. I definitely think they'll be very competitive again this year. In Tennessee, we have the Titans, who kind of are pulling a weird move similar to the Saints, but not as bad, where I don't really know what direction they're trying to go into. So they added Mason Rudolph. And listen, I love Mason Rudolph as a Steelers fan. I think he was a great team player, and he had a really good stretch of the season last year, but I've also seen a lot of bad stretches. So we'll see how him and Will Levis's competition are. I don't know if either one of them are good though. They added Tony Pollard, who is a good running back, and they added Calvin Ridley. Both of those are very good players, but they're not necessarily good enough to contend for winning playoff games. Obviously lost Henry. They also lost Sean Murphy-Bunting. They added Kenneth Murray. They added Cushenberry. So they're just one of those teams that I feel like they're kind of stuck in limbo between we're trying to be relevant, but we're also don't have enough talent to be relevant. I give them a B. I think the pickups are good. They probably overpaid for some of them. They also were able to trade for Snead for a third and a seventh, a third next year, which is not a ton to give up for one of the best corners in the league. You also had to pay him a lot of money though. So yeah, I just kind of think the Titans are in that weird limbo spot. So then over in Texas, we have the team that decided to make that tiny move and made me re-record. Even though before the trade, the Texans had already one of the best off seasons, and they were already going to have one of the most electric offenses. But then they traded for Stephon Diggs, star wide receiver. Now, Diggs slowed down pretty significantly towards the end of last season with the Bills, but I don't think that's completely the new Diggs. I think there were some other factors involved that contributed to that decline in production. But I thought the trade was a pretty fair trade value, and now they have one of the deepest and most talented offseasons in the whole league. Part of that is they also got Joe Mixon too. Now, I've never been a massive Joe Mixon fan, He's never been the most efficient running back, but I do think he's an upgrade at that position. And the Texans have done a wonderful job at understanding when you have an elite level QB on a rookie contract, you have to do everything in your power to compete during that time period. And they're also doing it on the defensive side of the field too, as they signed star defensive end Danielle Hunter, one of the best pass rushers in the league. They also boosted their run defense with some additions on the linebacker core and the interior defensive linemen. Two, which is very important because when you have to play teams like the Chiefs, the Ravens, and the Bills in the playoffs, they're all teams that show that they have an elite run game. You have to be able to stop them if you want to beat them in playoffs. So, the Texans already had an A+ before the Diggs trade. But now it becomes an even stronger A+ now, and assuming Stroud can continue that progression and he can take at least a small step forward at that position, I think the Texans will be one of those electric and fun to watch teams this offseason or this regular season. To finish off the video and finish off all these grades, we have the Indianapolis Colts, who didn't really do too much. They changed backup quarterbacks. They let Minshew go, and he was a great backup. But they're bringing in Joe Flacco, so we'll see if he can bring that Browns magic into the team. Hopefully, we don't have to see him play, and it's nothing against Flacco. I think we all just want to see Richardson play. I also think Flacco will be a pretty good veteran presence for Richardson. They re-signed Pittman, which obviously they needed to do. He's probably their best player on the team. They also kept defensive end Lewis. They had linebacker Franklin, defense tackle Stewart, quarterback Moore. None of these are massive names, but sometimes you don't really need to bring the massive names in. I give the Colts a B-. I don't really think they needed to do anything drastic. I think